Perl modules can be either object-oriented or procedural, or in some cases they can be both. Most modules today are object-oriented. Object-oriented code has these properties. Object-oriented code is dynamic. That means that the object determines what code to invoke, not the caller. So if I'm using an object-oriented module and I call a particular method inside that module, the object, depending on how I'm calling it and in what context, what's been inherited, things like that, will decide what code to run inside that module. Encapsulation is another important property of object-oriented code. And that means that the object contains all the code and all the data that it needs, and I don't have to worry about providing that. The details of how things are done are hidden from the user being the programmer, the one who's using the module. This is what's called abstraction, and that's also an important property of object-oriented code. And finally, one object may inherit the properties of another object. In fact, it can even inherit code. And this makes it easier to write object-oriented code. Once you already have a basis in other modules, you can inherit the code from those other modules and the data and use that in your code without having to write it over again. On the other hand, procedural code has these important properties. Sometimes it's a lot simpler to write procedural code. Small subroutines may be coded quickly and easily. Procedural code may be very modular. Functionalities may be used and reused, much like they can be in object-oriented code, but with the simplicity of the procedural. And procedural code tends to be more linear and sometimes more clear and more readable. So these are reasons why you might want to write your modules in object-oriented fashion or in a procedural fashion. And like I said, most modules are object-oriented these days. Object-oriented programming is very popular. Most of my modules are object-oriented because of the inheritance property makes it really easy to use for more complex tasks. But for very simple tasks, oftentimes a procedural approach is the approach that's going to make the most sense.